The colony was quiet under the soft light of the twin moons, and Daniel walked back slowly from the supply center with a bag of rations slung over his shoulder, thinking about how life on this distant planet had changed over the years and how much people had learned to adapt to its unusual rhythms and alien neighbors. Yet he still could not shake off the feeling that something different was stirring in the air, as if the settlement itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And as he reached his small dwelling near the edge of the housing district, he saw his neighbor Lyra standing outside her home, staring at the horizon with an intensity that unsettled him, because she usually avoided attention and preferred to keep her distance from the humans around her. Daniel had lived beside her for nearly 2 years now, and though they had exchanged polite nods and the occasional short greeting, they had never really spoken much. Her presence was quiet but powerful, and there was always an aura of mystery around her kind, with their tall forms, their luminous skin patterns, and their way of moving like flowing water. Yet tonight her stance was different. Her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes carried a strange light that seemed both restless and searching, and Daniel paused, wondering if she was in pain or if something else entirely was happening. Remembered once seeing a section in the colony handbook that mentioned the alien cycles and how every few years their bodies went through something called a season, a time when they became more sensitive and unpredictable. The handbook had not gone into much detail, only warning colonists to maintain respectful distance during such periods. Daniel had thought little of it at the time, assuming it was just another cultural difference that did not concern him, but now, with Lyra looking like she was about to collapse or erupt into something beyond his understanding, the words came back to him, and suddenly they felt less like a warning and more like an incomplete truth. The night was calm yet heavy with silence, and Daniel set his rations down and walked closer. Though careful not to alarm her, he asked softly if she was all right, but she did not answer. She only turned her gaze toward him, and for a moment he felt as though the air itself thickened around them. Her eyes glowed faintly like embers under water, and her voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper, telling him that the season had begun. Daniel did not know what to say. He had no guide for this moment, no training in how to react when an alien neighbor revealed something so personal and strange. Yet his instinct told him not to turn away, not to leave her alone. Lyra clutched at her arm as though steadying herself, and Daniel noticed faint luminous lines spreading across her skin, glowing brighter with each passing minute. It was beautiful in a way, but also unnerving, because the glow pulsed like a heartbeat, echoing the rhythm of something primal. He realized that whatever she was going through was not just a private matter, it was biological, overwhelming, and perhaps even dangerous. Yet her voice carried not threat but vulnerability when she asked him not to fear her because she could not control the changes that had begun. Daniel nodded, though inside his thoughts raced. He wondered where the rest of her people were, because usually during such cycles many of them traveled away into the deeper forests or mountains to be among their own kind. Maybe she had been left behind, or maybe she had chosen to stay near the humans. He did not know, but he felt a surge of sympathy because the signs were clear. She was alone and struggling, and no matter how strange or risky it felt, he could not simply pretend he had not seen it. Next day, the colony carried on as usual, children playing in the dust yards, traders setting up their stalls, workers heading toward the energy fields. But Daniel noticed whispers spreading quickly as others caught sight of Lyra's glowing patterns. Some colonists muttered warnings, telling each other to keep distance from her house, as if her very presence had turned into a hazard. Daniel disliked the way they looked at her, with fear disguised as caution. He knew fear was natural when dealing with what people did not understand, but he also knew isolation could be cruel, and he could not erase the image of her trembling hands from his mind. That evening he found himself once again at his doorstep, watching the light flicker from her window, her glow casting strange shadows on the wall. He hesitated, but his feet carried him forward as though drawn by something he could not resist. When she opened the door, she looked weaker than before, her voice more fragile, yet she still managed to ask him why he had come when most others were choosing to walk the other way. Daniel told her that he was only here to see if she needed help, nothing more, no hidden reason, only concern. Lyra stared at him as though trying to decide if she could trust him. And then she spoke slowly, explaining that her season had only just begun, and it would grow stronger in the days ahead. Her senses would sharpen, her emotions would swell, and her body would demand a bond of some kind. Without it, she could grow ill, even to the point of death. Her people normally supported one another during such times, but she had no one nearby, and she feared what would happen if she endured the season alone. Daniel listened quietly, every word sinking deeper into him. He had never imagined that something as simple as a cycle could hold such weight, such risk, and such need for connection. And he realized then that the colony handbook had hidden the truth, not because it was irrelevant, but because it was perhaps too uncomfortable for the settlers to face the idea that alien survival required intimacy and trust. Something humans were still hesitant to share. As the night deepened, Daniel felt caught between two worlds, one telling him to stay away, to protect himself, to obey the rules, and the other whispering that leaving her now would be cruel, that humanity's strength was not only in building walls, but also in reaching out. He left her house that night with his heart unsettled, yet a quiet resolve forming, because he knew the story was only beginning, and the days to come would test not only her survival but his courage as well. The days that followed carried a strange heaviness, as though the air around the colony had shifted, and Daniel could not ignore the way people avoided the path near Lyra's dwelling, their eyes filled with unease. Whenever her faint glow appeared through the windows, the whispers grew louder with each sunrise. Some said it was unsafe to let her remain among them. Others claimed the season made her kind dangerous and unpredictable. But no one stepped forward to speak with her, or to ask if she needed anything. They preferred distance and silence. Yet Daniel's thoughts were restless, for he could not forget her fragile voice, or the trembling lines of light on her skin. Every morning when he walked toward the supply post, he passed by her home, and sometimes he caught sight of her standing in the doorway, looking pale and strained, the luminous patterns across her arms flickering weakly, as though she was trying to suppress them. Once their eyes met, and Daniel felt an unspoken plea in her gaze, though she quickly turned away. Still, the message was clear. She was struggling more with each passing day, and though the colony handbook had warned of the risks, Daniel's instincts told him that leaving her to face it alone would be far more dangerous. One evening, when the twin moons rose high and painted silver shadows over the settlement, Daniel carried a small container of water and some dried rations and walked to her house. He hesitated only briefly before knocking gently on the frame. After a moment, the door opened, and Lyra appeared, her features weary, her glow more intense than before. Her voice shook slightly as she asked why he had come again when everyone else kept away. Daniel answered simply that he had brought supplies and that no one should endure hardship without at least some help. She looked at him for a long time, as if weighing his sincerity, and then stepped aside, letting him enter inside. The air felt warmer and heavier, as though charged with some unseen energy. The faint light flowing across her skin illuminated the small room and cast strange patterns on the walls. She accepted the water quietly and sipped slowly before setting it down, her hands trembling as she explained that the season was advancing faster than she expected. Her senses were heightening, every sound and scent overwhelming her, and the loneliness gnawed at her body, making her weaker. She admitted that normally her people shared the burden through bonds of presence and care, but she had chosen to remain near the humans this year because she believed she could endure it alone now. She feared that choice might have been a mistake. Daniel listened carefully, his heart tightening as he realized the weight she carried alone. He asked gently what could help her through it, though he was nervous about the answer. She gave him a faint smile that carried sadness as she explained that help was not so simple. The season demanded closeness, demanded connection that went deeper than food or water. Without it, her body would falter and her mind would spiral. Yet she also knew humans feared such closeness with her kind. and she had no wish to trap him or endanger him. By drawing him too far into her world, the room fell into silence, and Daniel felt the gravity of her words pressing down on him. He was just one man, an ordinary colonist with no special training or knowledge of alien biology, yet something inside him refused to step back. He thought of how the others in the colony whispered about danger while offering nothing but distance, and he knew he could not be like them. Lyra was not a threat to him. She was a living being struggling to survive, and in that truth, he saw his responsibility, even if it meant stepping into uncertainty. Over the next days, Daniel continued to visit her, sometimes bringing food, sometimes just sitting nearby while she tried to steady her breathing. Her voice grew softer, and her movements slower, but he noticed that when he was present, the trembling of her hands eased slightly, and the glow of her patterns softened into steadier rhythms. She told him that his presence calmed her senses because the season fed on isolation and fear, and when someone stayed close, it created balance. Though not the same as a true bond, it gave her strength enough to endure another day. Daniel realized then that his choice to stay near her mattered more than he had imagined, yet outside whispers turned into louder voices. A group of colonists approached him at the supply post one morning, their faces tight with concern. They warned him sternly that his visits to the alien neighbor were reckless, and that he was putting himself and perhaps the entire community at risk. One man said that if her season grew worse, she might lose control and harm him or others. Another said the colony leaders might decide to relocate her forcibly if she became unstable. Daniel argued that fear alone was no reason to abandon someone in need, but his words were met with doubtful looks and mutters that he was being naive. That night, when he told Lyra about the confrontation, she lowered her gaze and said quietly that she had expected this outcome. Humans still struggled to accept what her kind were at their most vulnerable. She said she would not blame him if he chose to stop visiting and to protect himself. Daniel shook his head and told her that leaving her was not an option, because compassion was not weakness, and he would not let fear dictate his choices. Her eyes softened at his words, and for the first time since the season began, she smiled not with sadness but with a fragile spark of gratitude that seemed to lift some of the heaviness from the room. The following day, Daniel returned again and found her sitting near the window, her glow stronger than ever, the patterns shifting in waves across her arms and neck. He realized the season was reaching deeper into her body, and the challenge was only beginning. She told him in a low voice that the coming nights would be the hardest, and that he should prepare himself, because what lay ahead would test both her control and his resolve. Daniel felt his heart pound, yet he did not back away. He promised her that whatever came, he would not abandon her, and so the days continued, the world outside carrying on with its ordinary rhythm, while inside her small dwelling, two lives began to intertwine in a quiet, fragile bond, made not of rules or customs, but of simple human choice. Daniel could not know what dangers lay ahead, or how far he would have to go to keep his word, yet he knew one thing with absolute clarity: he had already crossed the line that separated fear from trust, and once crossed, there was no turning back. The season deepened with every passing night, and the changes in Lyra grew harder for Daniel to ignore. Her luminous patterns no longer flickered in faint waves, but burned steady across her skin, glowing brighter whenever her emotions rose and dimming only when exhaustion pulled her down. He sat with her, often in silence, listening to the faint hum of her breathing and the subtle tremors that ran through her hands and arms, as if her body fought against itself. And though he did not fully understand the nature of what she endured, he understood the weight of her loneliness and how dangerous it was for her to bear it without support. Daniel found himself thinking often about how different life on the colony might be if people did not let fear dominate their choices. He had seen his neighbors cross streets to avoid her dwelling and whisper harsh words as though distance could erase their unease, yet he also knew that what Lyra needed most was not distance, but closeness, and it troubled him that the very thing that might save her was the very thing humans were too afraid to give. He wondered if empathy was truly such a rare trait, or if people had simply forgotten that survival meant more than building walls and drawing lines. One evening as he entered her home, he noticed her sitting near the floor, her eyes closed and her glow flaring unevenly across her skin like lightning trapped beneath the surface. Her breathing came in sharp waves, and when she opened her eyes, they carried a look of strain, mixed with something deeper, a raw hunger for balance. She whispered that the season was consuming her faster than she had feared, and that she could feel her strength breaking her body, demanded the bond she had spoken of, and without it she might soon lose control. Daniel's chest tightened, because though he had promised not to leave, he still did not know what it meant to form such a bond between human and alien, and whether it was even possible. He asked her quietly what would happen if she did lose control, and she lowered her gaze, her voice trembling as she said that her instincts would drive her to seek closeness at any cost, even if it frightened others, and that she might not be able to stop herself from reaching out in desperation. She begged him not to fear her and not to mistake instinct for malice. But the truth hung heavy in the room. If she broke and the colony saw her as a threat, they would not hesitate to act against her. Daniel felt the weight of choice pressing harder than ever, because helping her was no longer about kindness alone. It was about risking himself, and perhaps even challenging the colony's unspoken rules. The nights that followed, Daniel stayed longer by her side, sometimes speaking to her softly, sometimes just holding her gaze. When her trembling worsened, he noticed that when he remained calm, her breathing would steady, and the brightness of her patterns would ease into softer rhythms. She confessed that his presence gave her something close to what her people provided each other during the season. Though it was not a perfect bond, it was a thread of stability in the chaos she endured. Daniel began to realize that what she needed was not some alien ritual or mystery, but the simple courage of connection, a willingness to share space and time. When others fled, the whispers of the colony grew louder still. One afternoon, he overheard two colonists arguing near the water station. One claimed Daniel was endangering everyone by staying close to the alien neighbor, and another said the leaders were already discussing whether she should be removed for the safety of the settlement. Daniel felt anger burn in his chest because he knew none of them had spoken to her. None of them had seen the struggle in her eyes or the way she tried to fight her instincts just to spare the humans around her. He returned to her dwelling that evening, more determined than before. That night, Lyra told him something she had not shared before. She explained that her people believed the season revealed the truth of who they were, because when their instincts rose, they could not hide behind silence or distance. They had to face the need for connection and accept that survival was never meant to be carried alone. She said she feared that humans with their walls and rules might never understand this truth. Daniel listened closely, his thoughts turning over the idea again and again until he realized how deeply it applied not only to her kind, but to his own as well. Humans too needed connection. But pride and fear often disguised it as strength. As the season pressed on, Lyra grew weaker, her movements slower, her voice fading to a whisper, yet her eyes carried a desperate fire. Each time she looked at him, one evening when the glow across her body surged so bright it filled the room with pale light, she reached out her trembling hand and asked him if he was truly ready to walk further with her. Because if he stayed, the bond would deepen beyond simple presence, and there would be no turning back. Daniel felt the weight of the moment press upon him. He knew that others would see it as reckless or even dangerous, but he also knew that stepping back now would mean abandoning her at her most fragile. He reached for her hand slowly, and when his skin touched hers, a strange warmth passed between them, not burning but steady like the meeting of two currents. Finding balance, her glow pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, and for a brief moment, the tremors in her body eased. She closed her eyes, breathing more evenly, and whispered that his choice had given her strength, more than she thought possible. Daniel realized then that the bond might not be about species or blood, but about trust and the courage to stand beside another being. Even when the world insisted on turning away outside the colony, lights flickered and life continued as though nothing had changed. But within the small dwelling, something new had begun, something fragile, yet powerful, a bridge built not from fear, but from shared resolve. Daniel understood that what lay ahead would test them both harder than anything before, because the colony's suspicion was growing, and the peak of her season had yet to arrive. But for the first time he felt not only the burden of risk, but the quiet strength of purpose. He had chosen a path that could not be undone, and though danger loomed closer with each passing day, he knew in his heart that walking away was no longer possible. The nights grew heavier as the peak of the season drew closer, and Daniel could feel the pressure mounting both inside Lyra's small home and across the colony beyond her walls. When he walked through the streets, people gave him wary glances, and some even whispered openly that he was losing sense, that he had let an alien strangeness cloud his judgment. One evening, at the water station, an older colonist stopped him and said bluntly that if he continued to stay near her, he would bring danger, not only to himself, but to all of them. Daniel answered with calm words, saying that fear did not make their world safer, only colder. But he could see that his defense did nothing to soften their suspicion. Inside Lyra's dwelling, the atmosphere carried a different weight. It was charged like a storm waiting to break. Her glow had grown fierce, her patterns racing across her arms and neck in restless motion, her breathing uneven, and her hands often clutched at the edge of the table as though she fought to ground herself. Daniel sat with her night after night, speaking softly, reminding her that she was not alone. Sometimes he read aloud passages from old books brought from Earth, stories of endurance and hope. Though she could not fully grasp the words, she seemed to draw strength from the sound of his voice and the steady presence it carried. One night, as the moons rose higher than usual, casting long silver shadows across the colony, Lyra's glow flared so intensely that it spilled through the cracks of her shutters and drew the attention of nearby colonists. Daniel heard shouts outside demanding to know what was happening. One or two voices called for the leaders to act quickly before the alien lost control. Daniel's heart pounded as he turned back to Lyra, who trembled violently, her voice breaking as she told him that the peak was upon her. She could no longer suppress it alone, and that without him she might shatter into chaos. Daniel felt torn between two storms, one outside with human fear pressing at the door, and one inside with alien instinct threatening to overtake her. He took her trembling hands and told her that she would not face it alone, no matter the risk. She shook her head, warning that his closeness might bind them in ways no human had ever attempted. But he answered that the bond was not a trap, it was a choice, and his choice was already made. As her glow flared brighter, she let out a sound half-gasp, half-cry, and her body swayed toward him, instinct pulling her closer. Daniel steadied her and felt the strange energy coursing from her skin to his, like waves surging through the air. It was overwhelming, yet not painful. It was alive with something he could not describe, a call for balance and connection. He whispered calm words, telling her to breathe, to hold on. And he stayed steady as her trembling began to ease, and her breathing found a rhythm that matched his own. Outside, angry voices rose, demanding that the colony council intervene. A small group gathered near the dwelling, their torches casting orange light against the pale glow from within. Daniel heard the shouts grow harsher, accusing him of endangering everyone. Some threatened that if he did not leave her side, they would force him away. Lyra's eyes filled with sorrow when she heard the words, her voice weak as she said that she had never wished to bring harm or fear to the humans. She had only wanted to live among them in peace. Daniel clenched his jaw and told her that fear was not the truth of who they were. It was only the shadow of it. The door shook, his fists pounded against it, voices demanding that it be opened. Daniel stood firm, telling them through the wood that there was no danger, that she was not their enemy. But his words were swallowed by the rising wave of panic. Lyra's glow surged again, as if feeding off the tension in the air. And Daniel realized that if the mob forced its way inside the site, of her in that state would confirm every fear they already carried. He had to act quickly. He leaned close to her, speaking softly, reminding her to trust him, reminding her that she was not a monster, but a being fighting for survival. Her trembling slowed at his words, her glow steadying into calmer pulses. When the colony leaders finally arrived, they demanded Daniel step outside to explain himself. He told them plainly that Lyra was in the heart of her season and that she needed calm, not confrontation. He said that human strength was not built by abandoning those in need, but by standing with them even when fear whispered otherwise. His words did not silence the suspicion in their eyes, but they hesitated, unsure if storming inside would worsen matters. One of the leaders warned him that if anything happened, the blame would fall squarely on him. Daniel accepted the weight without flinching, saying he would answer for it, but he would not walk away. As the voices faded and the crowd slowly dispersed, Daniel returned to her side. Lyra gazed at him with eyes filled not with alien fire, but with quiet gratitude. She whispered that no one among her people would have expected a human to stand as he had, and that his choice had changed something within her. Daniel answered that perhaps it had changed something within him as well, for he could feel that his fear of her had dissolved completely, replaced by a strange sense of trust, stronger than he had known. The following days were not easy. The season pressed her harder each night, testing her strength and his resolve. Daniel remained beside her, guiding her through waves of instinct and emotion. When her hands shook, he steadied them. When her breath came fast, he slowed his own until she matched it. When her glow burned too bright, he whispered calm words until it softened each time he felt their connection deepen in ways he could not explain. Meanwhile, the colony remained restless, rumors spreading that Daniel had bound himself to the alien and that such a bond could not be undone. Some said he was no longer fully one of them. Others feared that Lyra would take advantage of his loyalty. Yet through all the suspicion, Daniel held fast, because he knew what he had seen with his own eyes. Not a monster, not a danger, but a neighbor fighting for life. On the 7th night of his vigil, Lyra finally looked at him with clear, steady eyes, her glow soft rather than frantic, and her voice calm rather than trembling. She told him that the peak had passed and that his choice had carried her through what she could not have survived alone. She said that, in her people's way, a bond formed during the season was sacred and lasting, but she would not hold him to it unless he wished it. Daniel felt the truth settle in his chest like a quiet flame, and he told her that the bond was not a chain, it was something he had chosen willingly. And so the crisis passed not in violence or fear, but in patience and resolve. Though the colony still looked at them with suspicion, Daniel knew the truth of what had been forged between them, and he felt certain that in time others would see it. The days after the peak of Lyra's season passed with a quietness that felt almost unreal compared to the storm that had come before. The glow across her skin softened into gentle rhythms, no longer frantic or overwhelming, and her hands no longer trembled with each breath. Daniel noticed that her voice grew stronger, her eyes steadier, her movements lighter, as though a heavy weight had been lifted from her body. She told him often that his presence had been the anchor she needed, and that without him she might have been consumed by the season's pull. And Daniel, though humbled by her words, knew that it was not only his presence that saved her, but also her own strength to endure. Yet outside her walls, the colony still watched with wary eyes, whispers drifting like dust in the air. Wherever Daniel walked, some people avoided him altogether, while others muttered under their breath that he had crossed a line no human should cross. The leaders summoned him one evening, asking questions about what had taken place behind her door during the long nights of her season. He answered honestly, telling them that there had been no danger, only fear, and that what saved her was not walls or threats, but the choice to stay with her. They listened, but their faces carried doubt, and Daniel realized that convincing them might take longer than surviving the season itself. Lyra noticed the distance too, and one night as they sat together, she asked him quietly, If he regretted the bond they had formed, because his people might never see him the same way. Daniel shook his head and told her that regret was born only from turning away when someone needed him, and that he had no regret because standing with her had taught him more about humanity than any colony handbook ever could. She smiled at his words, her eyes glowing faintly, not from the season, but from warmth, and she whispered that perhaps humans were stronger than her people had ever imagined, not because of weapons or walls, but because of the courage to reach across fear. In the weeks that followed, Daniel and Lyra began walking together in the open, not hiding from the colony's gaze. Some stared, some whispered, but neither turned away when children pointed curiously at the glowing patterns on her arms. Daniel would kneel down and explain gently that they were signs of her strength and her survival, not something to be feared. Lyra herself began to share small parts of her culture with the younger colonists, teaching them how her people read the patterns of the moons and how they shaped songs from the rhythm of their seasons. Slowly a few voices softened, though many still held suspicion. One evening the colony leaders called a gathering to address the growing tension. The square filled with people, their faces lit by the torches around the circle. The leaders spoke of safety and of the risks of letting fear control them. Then they asked Daniel to speak. Daniel stood before them, not as a rebel or as a man seeking conflict, but simply as one who had chosen compassion. He told them plainly that fear had nearly cost them a life that walls might protect, but they also suffocate. And that survival meant more than keeping danger away. It meant building trust when it was hardest to give. He said that his bond with Lyra was not a threat to the colony, but a sign of what was possible if humans remembered that empathy was there. True strength. The words stirred murmurs through the crowd. Some shook their heads, unwilling to accept, but others looked thoughtful. One young worker stood up and said that he had seen Daniel bring supplies to Lyra when no one else dared, and that perhaps he had shown more courage than those who hid. Another voice followed, saying that if humans could not even stand by one neighbor, then how could they ever hope to share this planet with others? The leaders did not give a final judgment that night, but Daniel sensed a shift. The silence of fear was cracking, replaced by questions that might lead to understanding. For Lyra, the end of the season meant renewal. She walked with steadier steps, and her glow no longer carried the frantic urgency of instinct, but the calm pulse of life. She thanked Daniel often, though he told her thanks was not needed because what he did was simply human. She replied that being human seemed to mean more than she had known when she first chose to live among them. She began helping in the colony gardens, using her knowledge of native plants to improve the soil, and though some still kept their distance, others began to accept her presence with cautious respect. Daniel noticed the change, too small at first, but real. The whispers grew quieter, the stares less sharp. One afternoon, he saw two children approach Lyra, shyly offering her a flower they had found, and instead of running, when her hand glowed faintly, they laughed at the shimmer as though it were magic. Daniel realized then that the path forward would not be swift or easy, but it had already begun. On the final night of her season, Lyra invited him to stand with her outside beneath the twin moons, the air cool and still. She told him that in her people's tradition, the one who remained with another through the season was forever part of their story, bound not by chains, but by choice. She looked at him with steady eyes, asking if he wished to carry that choice forward. Daniel answered without hesitation that he did, because he had already carried it from the first night. He refused to leave her alone. She smiled and raised her hand, the glow soft and calm, and when his hand met hers, it was not the desperate trembling of survival, but the steady rhythm of trust. The colony remained cautious, but Daniel knew change was like the moon, slow to shift yet constant in its turning. He believed that in time they would see what he had seen, not a threat, not a danger, but a neighbor who had needed help, and a bond that proved what humanity could be. The season had ended, but its lessons remained clear, that fear builds walls, while compassion builds bridges, and in the vast unknown of the stars, it would be bridges, not walls, that would carry humans forward, and so Daniel and Lyra stood side by side under the moons, no longer human and alien divided by silence, but companions bound by choice. Their story not one of fear, but of survival through connection, a story that whispered quietly through the colony, reminding them all that humanity was not measured only by strength of arm or wall, but by the courage to stand with another, even when the world demanded retreat. The end.